Hi again, YouTube fans. This is extremewirehead for another Vanguard clan intro. In this clan intro and all the other ones, I look into how a clan operates, how a beginner sees the clan, how you go through the motions of understanding the clan for the first time. What are the things to look out for? What do you want to know? What is the general game plan of the clan so that you understand how to play it and how to go up against it. I'm not going to be talking about meta decks, meta cards, because those things change on a monthly to yearly basis. What's more important to me is that you understand how they think, why they think, how they operate, and all that stuff. When you get right down to it, you should take a look at the list of cards, the stuff that you want to play around with, and figure out the deck list before you even go out and buy any. But my take on the whole thing is you have to understand what you're getting yourself into, the kind of style that you're trying to emulate within the clan. For today, I want to take a look at Murakumo. Murakumo is a clan of anthropomorphized ninjas, who anthropomorphized animals, I should say, who are ninjas, and they have one, I think, very disenfranchised skill within the entire Vanguard community. Back in the early days, nobody really took them seriously because of the fact that their skill is kind of crap, and honestly, that is true. Compared to players like Neonectar, and plays like Royal Paladin and all the Paladins really, you have a skill that allows you to call in large numbers but at very high cost, and the fact that they return to the deck after you call without any reasonable way of using them and removing them from losing that advantage. You have a clan that's very flashy but otherwise is really weak compared to the skills of the other clans. Of course, in recent memory, they have grown to a far more interesting way of play and far fairer, I think. And because of these many different reasons, they are actually a somewhat decent clan now and have their own take, their own spin on the strategy. That's the entire reason we play this game, because at some point people understand that maybe there's an interesting way they can do this, and Bushiroad offers us a solution. So, Murakumo is all about copying things, and they copy things for additional superior calls. In many cases, these superior calls do affect some other skills down the line, but they basically do a bunshin. If you've ever heard of ninjas in other media, they make shadow clones, and these shadow clones are actually real clones because they come from the multiple copies that are inside your deck. If nothing is done, they are returned back to the bottom of the deck, so you have to make sure that you do play out the skills in the correct order, otherwise you're just gimping yourself because you lose out on those cards. To get down to it, we're going to have to go look at the cards because it is a rather technical way of looking at it. I really want to skip the G4 actually in this case, because the G4 is not going to help you understand anything until you see a little more of the other pieces. So in breaking with tradition to the entire clan archetype and way of thinking that I've done so far, I will not be starting with the G4. In this case, I will be starting with the G3. And of course, the G3 I'm going to start with first is the Strider known as Stealth Rogue of Revelation Yasui. When your rear guard is put into the deck due to effect of one of your cards, even at the end of your turn, search your deck for one card with the same name as that card, call it to R, and shuffle your deck. It basically turns a shadow copy into an actual copy. Decent skill, can be used once, GB2. The actual stride skill is Counterblast 1. Choose one of your rear guards, search for two copies, call them to separate R, and at the end of that turn, the units called with this effect are put into the bottom of the deck. This is just tells you what I've mentioned before. If you don't do anything, if you don't play out any of the other skills within the clan, it is a rather weak skill because at the cost of one, you don't actually get more. You do get one more unit, but then they both disappear anyway, so it's kind of hurts you. Sometimes you want this to happen, sometimes you don't. Because of a couple of different reasons, it's kind of difficult to start with. On the plus side though, since Bushiroad understood that they were disenfranchised back in the past, there are now a lot of interesting ways that you can get around this and make some awesome plays. Otherwise, I can't really talk too much about this card. This card is an enabler. A lot of the cards that we're going to have to look at is the enabler to some other great effect. The next G3 that I want to look at, and probably more importantly, it's one of those cards that shows you how strange Kumo used to be back in the day. How they had to go through all these to get to where they are today. And that of course is Shirayuki, the G3 Shirayuki. Fantasy Petal Storm Shirayuki. You don't need to know the card text too much. Basically, discard a copy from your hand of her exact card, and your opponent who is attacking you gets minus 20,000, which is a very decent skill for a single counterblast and a single drop. Nowadays, it isn't such a big deal, but these strange skills, these strange ideas. You're gonna see a couple of more of them in a moment, but a lot of weird ideas ended up in Murakumo. Maybe because they wanted them to embody a more toolkit style, even though they were kind of difficult to pull off. And I like that idea. They have a lot of interesting things, much like this next card, the G3 Zenbaku, Dueling Dragon Zenbaku. I used to love this card because of how interesting an interaction it had. At the beginning of your opponent's ride phase, if your opponent has a grade 3 or greater Vanguard and chooses to ride, they must discard a card, otherwise they will not be allowed to do so. This does stop cards and plays that involve changing your G3 in different reasons. Just a normal ride, really. You don't really stop any of the special rides or anything like that, but it does alter the way of thinking. It used to stop decks that involve rewriting into different iterations. It really hurts when you have to discard a card at the start of your turn. In that sense, you're as I've shown you, and probably I'm gonna show you one more that really does reinforce the fact that this is a very tech-oriented clan. Stealth Beast Metamorphox. Again, breaking with tradition. Again, breaking with tradition. Here's a grade 1 that does basically nothing other than just unlock something. It is very specific, very specialized for its role, and quite difficult, honestly, to make any reasonable sense without some fiddling to get done right. So, let's get down to some of the other pieces that do make this clan operate and try to work our way back to how they get to their amazing gameplay, which is going to take a while to get into. The next card I want to look at is Charcoal Fox. Stealth Beast Charcoal Fox. When this unit is placed on R, choose up to 4 of your Charcoal Foxes and they get plus 2k until end of turn. This card means that when you call multiple copies, they keep getting plus 2 and plus 2 and plus 2, and they burst out into large numbers. Interestingly enough, because of the fact that the Strider and many of the other pieces return the cards to the deck, you can repeat these effects over and over again, meaning you can actually have multiple of these power plays over a couple of turns, and you only need one Charcoal Fox in the field. This by itself already shows you one of the major problems with the clan. They must have a copy on the field, and if that is lost, they have to get themselves another copy without using one from hand, because that means it's not coming from deck and becoming another shadow copy. Very difficult to get into, but honestly, there are only a couple of clans that can deal with the G1 on the back row anyway, so it's not too bad, but it is still an issue you need to worry about. The next card I think that really shows off these fancy plays is the G2 Stealth Rogue of the Flowered Hat Fujino. When another Fujino is placed on the field until end of turn, this unit gets plus 2k, and when its attack hits, choose a choose a card in damage zone, turn it face up. Because of how Murakumo operates, it is a very strong card. Only because of how Murakumo operates. In any other clan, this would be a somewhat okay choice to maybe not so good because you run out of copies really quickly. In the case of Murakumo, you could actually envision yourself keeping the calls up because they will keep calling far longer than any of the other clans. Because of that, and because you can have multiple copies at once, this is actually a decent card that can be effective for maybe 4 turns out of an entire game, which is really good when you think about it. And since it pays for itself and pays for the Yasui cost, it does become an infinite loop. Very interesting. It isn't used so much nowadays, but I think it's still an interesting card to look at. The next card I want to look at is going back to some of the other ways that the clan does things. Stealth Fiend Oborokart. Oborokart is a card that tries to call other copies of other cards and not itself. Very specifically about that, and there have been newer cards in the past that have done this. They need enablers. That's the difficulty of this clan and the way that they operate. They need cards to enable these combos, and sometimes the combos that do show up within your game will not match that fact. It is a very fine line of trying to temper the amazing skills of when things are copied and the cards that require copying or do copy for you to make the effective plays possible. This is one of those cards, probably one of the older ones, but I still think it's important to note because you need enablers. This clan operates on an engine that has maybe 3 or 4 steps, and sometimes step 3 and step 2 are lost. And because you can't get to step 4 without step 2 and 3, you're going to have to work your way around getting through all of those pieces before you can get down to the nitty and gritty of fighting with really, really powerful plays. The next G1 I want to look at is Stealth Fiend Lake Diver. I should slow down. Stealth Fiend Lake Diver. A very similar card to some of the older cards, but I think it's more important that you see this one because of how it operates. When this is placed on R, counterblast 1, search for up to 2 copies of itself and call them to R. Every time you call Lake Diver onto the field, it can actually call 2 more copies of itself. If you notice from the way that these calls are being made, you could actually use it again if you wanted the full 4, although the costing would catch up to you because it's 4 copies for 2 counterblast. Not so great, but you do allow to call multiple copies when you need it, and they all go back to the deck afterwards, which is pretty good and especially good for what we're going to talk about later. So just keep in mind, sometimes the enablers are not on different cards, sometimes they are on themselves, and sometimes that is their entire gimmick. One of the last cards that I want to look at is the G2 Fushimi. This is a rather old card and it's supplanted by a lot of the newer cards now with other effects. But one of the things that you should note is sometimes they had strange effects that actually became archetypes within the clan itself. When this unit rides as a Murakumo on the G2, or maybe if you G2 a second time, if this unit would attack, it may attack the opponent in the back row instead. In other words, it is one of the few decks, one of the few clans in the cardfight world that can actually spend their battle phase attacking the back row. And because of their this ability to attack the back row, they have grown into a rather specific and very special clan to me. Before, the multiple copies were a bit difficult to deal with because you were lacking in power to make those fancy plays. But now you've got units that can attack from the back row, units that can attack the opponent's back row, being able to be everywhere much like a ninja and being able to attack from multiple variants and figure out where the real weakest point is I think very thematic and does allow for these lower power numbers and these higher power numbers to make sense in many different builds. It is an awesome idea. I love this card, and it was such a great idea back in the day, and I really like how they've expanded upon the usage of such a card. The last card I want to look at before we go to the strides is one of their first starters, Stealth Beast Evil Ferret. Put this into the bottom of your deck. Choose up to 1 Murakumo from your hand, call it to R at the beginning of your end phase, return it to your hand. In other words, you can repeat the call at the cost of actually putting a copy of Evil Ferret into your deck, which isn't such a big deal. Now, because it actually goes back into the deck, you could repeat this once, maybe twice in the entire game, which is actually kind of dirty. But being able to play a card and then returning it back into your hand means that you can offload the effectiveness of a single card and make it usable over the course of 2 turns, which is very, very good. It makes it very effective and does mean that since it returns to your hand, very few other clans can deal with control-oriented plays such as that. Very good card. Even today, I think. It is, I think, supplanted by some of the other starters that have come out since then, but I still think it is a decent card, especially if you're just trying to understand how Murakumo operates, because some of the other choices are a bit complicated. And finally, we're looking at a card that I think really does embody how crazy sometimes the costing, and amazing the skills can become. Ambush Demon Stealth Dragon Homura Raider is going to be the most complicated card we're going to be looking at in this entire clan. You have to keep in mind that the clan, as we've seen so far, makes multiple copies, and those copies are actually on loan. They return to the deck at the end of the turn, unless you do some fancy schmancy stuff to keep them or put them into your hand. In this case, we have an Axe skill that's Counterblast 2. Choose a copy of this card in your G zone, turn it face up. If the number of cards in your G zone is 2 or more, until the end of turn, this unit gets -1 drive check, so twin drive rather than triple drive, at the end of your battle that this unit attacked the Vanguard. Choose one of your rear guards. If you do, choose 3 of your rear guards with the same name as this unit. Return them to your deck. If you turn 3, stand this unit, shuffle your deck. It is a very strange card because it does allow you to restand at the cost of 3. So since you've got a drive check of 2 and you have to return 3 copies, it is technically a -1. Now, the costing and the way that it's worded means that you're allowed to put in copies of Shadow Clones that were supposed to get shuffled back into the deck anyway. In theory, you could make copies, spend them for the cost, make more copies, spend them for the cost, and restand twice. Because of the way that this card is costed, it's actually pretty fair, even though it looks like a -1, because those cards were not going to be a plus to you in the first place. So in general, I do think this is an amazing card because of the way that it operates and the fact that you could actually spam multiple stands if you can somehow get more copies onto the field. In some other ways, though, it is very difficult to pull off. And remember, since you're reshuffling copies into the deck, you could lose the effectiveness of your triggers because of the number of cards you're returning to the deck in such a fast manner. But in many ways, I still think Homura Raider is definitely a powerful card that does get to see a lot of play nowadays and really does create a finisher to round out the entire system. These ninjas are very good at prolonging the game. They're very good at creating plays that make amazing attacks multiple ways, but they didn't have any really good ways to finish out the game. And because of that weakness, they did trouble to get through that system. With the addition of Homer Raider, they've got something. But in general, you have to see what I'm getting at. You have a clan that goes through the motions of calling some units, calling some shadows of those units, returning those shadows, and doing it again for another turn. In terms of long-lived expansion over the course of an entire game, they are capable of outlasting a lot of players, but to get to that point, they do weaken themselves in the mid game, and they do have difficulty trying to set themselves up from Homer Raider because Homer Raider requires 3 copies of the same card, which is rather difficult mid to late game. In that sense, they are well balanced, and I think they are an excellent clan to learn and play through rather than learn. I do think that they are a rather difficult clan to in general play with. So it is a very highly technical clan that I wouldn't advise to even intermediate players. You've got to be rather well versed into the world of Vanguard and the different clans to get a good grasp of what the hell you're doing and how to go about many of the different problems that will be put in front of you. But if you can pull it off, then you're a badass because this clan is actually very, very interesting and can have so many ways to get around a lot of the plays because the parts just go back into the deck. They can't be stopped because they were in your hand. They can't be stopped because they were in your graveyard. They're all in the deck, so it is very hard for an opponent to try to stop you from making all these fancy plays. Anyway, this has been Extreme Wirehead. I hope you enjoyed. I'll talk to you next time when I've got another clan intro ready, but in the meantime, take a look at Murakumo because I think they're a rather exciting clan. Peace.